Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our fourth annual side event to the high-level forum on the culture of peace, Learning Interrupted, Education, COVID-19, and the Culture of Peace, organized in partnership with the Office of the President of the United Nations General Assembly. Around the UN, September in New York means the end of one session of the General Assembly and the opening of the next. But it also means the start of the new academic year, back to school for scores of children and youth in New York and around the world. Both of these facts have, of course, been greatly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. So both the annual high-level forum on the culture of peace and the opening of the 75th General Assembly later this month will be mostly virtual, and students all over the world are dealing with uncertainty about what their education in the coming months will entail. My own daughter, I'm a parent, as I'm sure many of you are, my own daughter will be starting 8th grade in a matter of days in the New York City public school system, and she remains anxious, uncertain about whether she wants to attend class in person, part-time, or remain all remote, as so many others. It is an anxious time, to say the least, for students, parents, teachers, school staff, and administrators all around the world. And to make matters worse, in many contexts, education in the age of the coronavirus has become politicized, exacerbating divisions and inhibiting rational policymaking. So clearly, I think we could all benefit from a recommitment to pursue a culture of peace. The concept of the culture of peace was introduced in the multilateral system in 1992 in a program of the UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. The United Nations, in a series of resolutions and programs looking ahead to the 21st century, called for a transition from the culture of war to a culture of peace. And in 1999, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration and Program of Action on a Culture of Peace. Much like the holistic nature of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Program of Action adopted by the General Assembly in 1999 identified 8 pillars of the culture of peace that are interrelated and interdependent, and education was first among them, acknowledging that achieving peace requires not just preventing violence, but also supporting the structures, attitudes, and institutions that underpin a sustainable, peaceful environment. Through education, we teach children not to hate, said Ban Ki-moon to the opening session of the General Assembly High-Level Forum on the Culture of Peace in 2012. Through education, he said, we can seek to raise leaders who act with wisdom and compassion. Through education, we work to establish a true lasting culture of peace and understanding. So we have to ask, what happens when education is interrupted on such a large scale in so many countries around the world? As many as 188 countries, according to UNICEF. And according to UNESCO, 1 billion students worldwide have faced school closures this year or continue to face uncertainty about their education in the coming months. What will be the long-term impact on these children and youth? How will it affect social, political, and economic development? Already, concerns have been raised that interrupted learning exacerbates inequalities of all kinds, including economic, gender, and nutritional inequalities. So what can we do to mitigate these risks? We have a great panel to discuss all of this. There's a lot to talk about. And I will introduce the panel in just a moment. But first, we have a couple of opening remarks. First, we have opening remarks from His Excellency Tijani Mohammed Bandi, President of the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Mr. President, the virtual floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm highly delighted to welcome you all to this third event. COVID-19, the subject of interest, is a calamity unlike any other. There is no region of the world that is immune to its destructive impact. From the way we conduct ourselves in workplaces and office elevators, to how we interact with one another in shopping malls and in public squares, we've had to be mindful of the protocol that the fast spreading and deadly outbreak decree. The education sector has been particularly destabilized by the pandemic. COVID-19 has ravaged the world and disrupted learning opportunities of students around the world, particularly those in technologically disadvantaged regions. Even before the onset of COVID-19, the world was faced with a learning crisis. The latest review of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development indicates that the world is not on track to attain goal number 4, inclusive quality education. The 2019 High-Level Political Forum noted that 1 in 3 children in the Africa region did not finish primary school. Only 20 million of 158 million children in sub-Saharan Africa meet the minimum proficiency levels in reading and mathematics. Then came COVID-19, and the education of roughly 1.6 billion children and youth, including those in refugee camps, took a hit. While learning continued online in technologically advanced societies, students without access to digital connections either stayed at home while the pandemic lasted or relied on home tutoring and parental guidance during this difficult time. To promote and sustain the culture of peace, government must act proactively and creatively to redress ongoing and future imbalances in access to quality education. It is important for education to be given primary consideration in all of our efforts to build back better and stronger, to ensure we truly leave no one behind. I thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. President. I think you lay out highlight some of the challenges quite well, and also the role that member states have in order to help improve the chances that we can build back better and leave no one behind. Next, we have a brief video message from our partner, Mr. Abdulaziz Saad Al Babtain, who is director and founder of the Al Babtain Foundation in Kuwait, and also a longtime patron of the culture of peace. Allow me to take this opportunity to thank Mr. Al Babtain for his support and his longtime friendship to IPI over the years. Please play the video.
بسم الله. الصديق العزيز تيري رود لاريسون رئيس المعهد الدولي للسلام، السيد تيجاني محمد باندي رئيس الجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة، السادة ممثلو الدول والسفراء وممثلو المنظمات الدولية وممثلو المجتمع المدني، أرجو أن تكونوا جميعا صحة جيدة. إنه ليسعدني أن أرحب بكم جميعا لمشاركتكم في هذه الندوة الافتراضية التي تأتي ضمن سلسلة الندوات التي جرت العادة أن ينظمها حضوريا المعهد الدولي للسلام بالاشتراك مع مؤسسة عبد العزيز سعود البابطين الثقافية على هامش المنتدى الدولي رفيع المستوى حول ثقافة السلام للأمم المتحدة. كما أتقدم لفريق عمل المعهد بجزيل الشكر على مواصلة تنظيم هذه الدورة سنويا رغم صعوبة ظروف التواصل عالميا بسبب الوباء. وأجدد ثنائي على مبادرة لجنة كومباس حول المقاربات متعددة الأطراف للأوبئة والأمن والتنمية المستدامة التي اقترحها السيد لاريسون. أما بخصوص التعليم وكوفيد 19 وثقافة السلام، أود أن أبدي ملاحظتين جوهريتين. الأولى هي إجماعنا على مبدأ تعميم الفائدة، وأني أقصد تعميم التعليم والمعارف الأصيلة على كل بلدان العالم، فقيرها وغنيها، على قدم المساواة إذن فإن الدرس الأول الذي نتعلمه من الأزمة هو أن بعضنا في حاجة إلى بعض، ذلك أن كوفيد-19 كشف لنا حاجتنا المتبادلة وضرورة أن نعمل معا لنتشارك في المعرفة والعلوم والأبحاث، لا على صعيد الجانب الفردي بهدف جمع المال فقط، فهذا أمر مشروع، بل لنستفيد من المعرفة الفكرية المشتركة المعمقة بيننا لإيجاد العلاج للإنسانية. إن المجتمعات تكون أكثر ثراء بمعارفها المعممة التي هي الجامع المشترك بينها، والنتيجة النبيلة العظيمة هي أن تعميم التعليم والمعرفة وثقافة السلام العادل إنما تنتهي بنا إلى تعميم الفائدة. إنه مسار مترابط، أي حاجة متبادلة مشتركة. أما الملاحظة الثانية هي إجماعنا على ما نسميه جميعا الترابط متعدد الأطراف كآلية بديلة عن التعاون الكلاسيكي حتى نتجاوز القطبية الأحادية والصراع بين المجموعات الاقتصادية. وبذلك فإن الدرس الثاني الذي نتعلمه من هذا الوباء هو تقوية الترابط العالمي بين الدول والأمم ليكون أكثر فاعلية، أساسه الفائدة المتبادلة. إذن علينا أن نعيد تنظيم العالم وفق اقتصاد عالمي جماعي، فالمسؤولية تقع على الاقتصادات الكبيرة في العالم لإعادة توجيه البشرية نحو العمل وتنمية قدرة مختلف المجتمعات على المشاركة. في النهاية أني أعتقد أن أهم درس من كوفيد-19 هو أن نموذج العولمة السابق يجب أن نتجاوزه نحو نموذج جديد متعدد الأطراف يقوم على الترابط المعتمد أساسا على تعليم ثقافة السلام العادل. هو تجمع مشترك يجمع كل الأطراف القوية والأضعف على أساس التضامن العضوي، أي التضامن المستدام من أجل ترابط مستدام ومن أجل شكل جديد للعولمة، حيث هو وأنا وأنتم ونحن نكون حاضرين جميعا باختلاف هويتنا وثقافاتنا ولغاتنا وأدياننا وألواننا. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Babtain, for your commitment to the culture of peace over so many years. We have a great panel now ahead of us to discuss all of these issues. I will briefly introduce each one of you, and then we'll just go right into it. So, first of all, we have Ambassador Rabab Fatima, who is permanent representative of Bangladesh to the United Nations in New York. Previously, she was Bangladesh ambassador to Japan, as well as regional representative for South Asia for the International Organization of Migration and head of human rights at the Commonwealth Secretariat in London. Next, we'll have Stefania Giannini, who is the top UN official in the field of education as UNESCO's Assistant Director General for Education. She was previously the Minister of Education, Universities and Research of Italy, as well as a senator and the rector of the University for Foreigners of Perugia. Finally, we'll hear from Robert Jenkins, who is Chief of Education and Associate Director, Program Division of UNICEF. He was previously Deputy Director of Policy and Strategy at UNICEF and has over 20 years of extensive field experience at the management and program levels in Jordan, Uganda, Bangladesh, Myanmar, India, and Mozambique. So we have a tremendous amount of experience and expertise around the table. Ambassador, I know you have to sign off a little bit early due to a prior engagement, but we are grateful for your time and leadership, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Lupel, and my apologies right at the outset that I may have to leave early because I have got another engagement that I have to attend to, but my colleagues will be here, so if there is anything that comes up, they'll be more than I'm sure they will be able to respond to those. President of the General Assembly, Vice President Adam Lupel, distinguished fellow panelists, Ms. Giannini and Mr. Jenkins, distinguished guests and dear friends, it gives me great pleasure to join you all today, and I thank IPI for giving me this opportunity to share a few thoughts. For me personally, the annual commemoration of the culture of peace holds special significance. As I've shared at the General Assembly meeting this morning, more than 20 years back, as a young delegate, I was part of the core team that mooted the idea of the culture of peace. It is indeed heartening to see today the notion not only having emerged as a dominant theme at the UN, but also embraced by the wider international community, especially with the NGOs and the CSOs like IPI, the GM COP, partnering. The movement on a culture of peace and nonviolence has not only got stronger and mainstreamed in the discourse has got only stronger and mainstream in the discourse of any global crisis. And I thank IPI for championing the cause of the culture of peace. Having endured a hard-fought war of independence, we realized the importance of peace from the very beginning of our nationhood. In his maiden speech at the United Nations in 1974, our founding father, Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, had said, "Peace is an imperative for the survival of mankind. It represents the deepest aspirations of men and women throughout the world, and that has shaped the enduring commitment of Bangladesh to the cause of global peace." That is also what inspired Bangladesh to introduce and lead the GA resolution, declaration and program of action on a culture of peace that was adopted by the General Assembly in 1999. The declaration and program of action identified education as one of the key action areas, which eventually found reflection in Agenda 2030 under SDG 4.7 that reiterates the principle of promotion of culture of peace and nonviolence as a global, as well as global citizenship by 2030. Dear colleagues, a culture of peace nurtured and promoted through education can play a catalytic role in promoting intercultural and interreligious dialogue, bridging divides and discrimination across and within societies, and fostering mutual respect, peace, harmony, and tolerance. Inculcating a culture of peace should begin at a young age. In Bangladesh, our school curriculum introduces peace perspective at an early age. Followers of different faiths coexist in our society in harmony. Mr. Chair, the theme of today's discussion, education, COVID-19, and the culture of peace, is a very timely and pertinent one. We are passing through an unprecedented crisis. The pandemic has created the largest disruption of education systems in history, with severe consequences for children everywhere. The Secretary General's policy brief on education during COVID-19 and beyond gives us a sobering picture. The pandemic has affected nearly 1.6 billion students in over 190 countries. And a majority of them are in the developing world without access to connectivity and distance learning. A good majority may not be able to return to school for reasons ranging from poverty, child labor, and child marriages. As children stay out of school, there is increased exposure to violence and exploitation, adversely impacting on their mental health and overall well-being. This week, the Executive Board of UNICEF is meeting, and the overarching theme of the session is education. You will hear more about that from fellow panelist, Mr. Jenkins, in a short while. It is encouraging to see for us that all UN entities, especially UNICEF and UNESCO, and other stakeholders supporting and working closely with national governments in mitigating the crisis at hand. We will be hearing more about that from the other distinguished panelists from UNICEF and UNESCO. Mr. Chairman, in Bangladesh, the economic stimulus package that we rolled out following the pandemic, which is for about $13 billion, includes allocation for expansion of the monthly stipend program for students and cash delivery for affected families. Since March, all educational institutions were locked down, which helped us greatly to control the spread of the virus. Various sectors of the economy are gradually opening up to balance life and livelihood. School reopening in a safe way is under active consideration also. In order to continue education and learning during the pandemic, we have introduced various alternative methods. The state-run television channels are running distant learning programs for students of primary and secondary schools. Some schools are taking online classes, but these initiatives, I have to say, are very limited, and many challenges remain, not only in my country, but I think globally, especially in the in the developing world, this is very evident. Only about 30% of children from the developing world actually have access to online education, and I'm sure our colleagues on the panel will elaborate further on that. It is therefore imperative that COVID response and recovery efforts include adequate measures and resources to ensure the right to education of all children. Both immediate and long-term response plans and programs must be planned and undertaken to address the disruptive situation in the education sector. The pandemic exposed, as I had earlier said, the digital divide that hinders education for all. To make up for lost grounds, we can leverage the focus of culture of peace on education to review, innovate, and restructure conventional education, including in research and development. Mr. Chair, distinguished delegates, national efforts of the governments in the developing world would need to be supported. International cooperation and partnership are required more than ever before to overcome gaps in education systems, especially in infrastructure, human resources and funding, and bridging the digital divide if we are to reach the SDG 4, in particular for low and lower middle income countries. We do not wish to see the pandemic become a generational crisis. Mr. Chair, the culture of peace could act as a force multiplier in our pursuit. It could help bring back the much needed inclusivity in pandemic response and SDGs implementation. I thank you once again for your attention, and I thank you for this opportunity to share a few words. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for again reminding us of the extraordinary leadership of Bangladesh in the origins of the agenda for the culture of peace, and also the important highlighting the connection between the culture of peace now and this and the Sustainable Development Goals, both of which are holistic agendas that we need to think about together. I think also it's extremely important this point that you make about the risk that the longer children are out of school, the higher the risk of it that they're to be exposed to various forms of exploitation. And as we return to school, we really have to keep an eye on the rights of the poorest, the most vulnerable to education. And so many of us are turning towards online education as a solution, but as you point out, so many do not have that access. And so it's really interesting to me, the point that you made, that we've seen in some other countries turning to television as radio as a potential source. And thank you. Also, I really like this idea of thinking the culture of peace agenda as a force multiplier, in some way to use it as an opportunity to think about, as we go back to school and think about our education systems in a new way post-pandemic. How can we use the culture of peace as a mechanism to help us to rethink about how we can transcend divisions and all the issues that fall from it? So wonderful, thank you so much. I know you'll have to leave early, but I really do appreciate your contributions for now. Great. Now we turn to UNESCO. Ms. Stefania Giannini, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank the IPI, International Peace Institute, for dedicating this very timely meeting to the largest disruption in education we had since the creation of the UN system, and for sure we can say in history. Well, talking about the culture of peace and education is very much going to straight on to the core of UNESCO mandate. UNESCO is founded on the belief that the defenses of peace must be constructed in the minds of people, and education is an indispensable tool for human dignity. Inequality, exclusion, and denial of human rights and democratic principles weaken these defenses, for sure. And the COVID-19 crisis has exposed our interdependencies and the fragility to an unforeseen degree. And it has hit the most vulnerable hardest. This is something that from the very beginning we could see, and we alerted a bit the world about the risk of increasing amplified inequalities. As interrupting education because of poverty, disability, family circumstances, or lack of access to technology, something that has been already suffered in many regions of the world. So our global education monitoring report, recently published this year within the COVID pandemic, estimates that 40% of poorest countries failed to provide specific support to disadvantaged learners during the pandemic. And it has exposed children to increased levels of violence and driven home the critical role that schools play in providing social protection. We realize that definitely that schools are not simply and crucially places where we learn, but very much more than this. Places where there is a social protection, there is nutrition, there is health, and there is a social first relationship with the rest of the world outside the family. So the pandemic has unleashed a wave of fake news. This is another dimension we have to underline. Hate speech, xenophobia, and everything has been amplified on social media networks. At the same time, this crisis has revealed also some admirable acts of solidarity. I should say that solidarity can consider one of the key words on the red line of the process we are running. On the part of individuals from all walks of life, who invented ways to break isolation and somehow meet basic human needs. And we have also witnessed the power of governments, the resourcefulness of governments, communities, teachers first to find creative solutions almost overnight, jumping from the traditional classroom to the virtual ones in order to ensure learning continuity. I should say that the main purpose of us as UNESCO, but all our community, I'm sure Rob Jenkins will take point back in his speech, was from the very beginning assuring learning continuity to all children in the world. Now we are entering in a second phase, the so-called new normal, one that has basically to bridge the fault lines that have widened during this pandemic, be it economic, social, or digital. And nearly now 24 million additional children and youth from pre-primary, preschooling to university level are at risk of dropout this year in 2020 due to the pandemic's economic impact alone. The economic shock associated with the COVID-19 crisis will be a huge one, significantly the largest than we saw of the financial crisis of 2008-9. And fiscal pressures could lead to decline in education budgets at a time when more resources are required to make schools safe, to address learning losses, to support teachers. This is the big chapter of reopening safe. And our responsibility now as an international community is really to avert what the Secretary General just defined, a generational catastrophe, the risk of a generational catastrophe we have in face of us. And schools are reopening, but out of the 900 million students who are supposed to start now in the coming weeks, or this week as well in many countries, a new academic year, between August and mid-October, only half of them have assurances they can return to full-time in-person classes. And hundreds of millions of learners will begin their new school year at home exclusively or through a hybrid model, which is a solution already put in practice in many countries. So, however education happens, it has to happen on grounds that are more inclusive, caring, and geared to ensuring that learning carries value. The question of value, the question that we have to relaunch the mission of the 4.7 that Madam Ambassador already mentioned is really very much to be put at the very core of the recovery policy in education, building back better. And this crisis provides also an opportunity to reimagine education, an opportunity to build more resilient education systems that respect diversity and work for all. Cultural diversity for us is a critical point, and I think that we have the opportunity to push on that. Then a culture of peace is intimately linked to a culture of inclusion. And this is the starting points for educational recovery, pulling all the stops to ensure that the most marginalized children, the youth, return to school and learn in safe environments with special attention to girls, with special attention to refugees and conflict situations. Already before this crisis, close to half the student population was disengaged from learning. We know numbers, I'm going to repeat today, not acquiring fundamental and basic skills after several years of schooling. And education should be a bulwark against inequality. Instead, poor quality amplifies the social divides. A long-term outlook in education is critical because the returns, let me say, the results flourish over time. Let me put an example concretely. When you invest in early childhood today, for example, the benefits are reaped over a lifetime. So it's not something you can measure and you can evaluate in a short while. And the second point is that this crisis and the kind of anxiety and loss it has generated so far has also highlighted the urgency to invest more in social and emotional skills. It's a bit like the more we leverage the technology and the more we have to take care of the humankind, of the human side of the educational process. And these skills nurture empathy, awareness, capacity to manage emotions, and also to develop positive relationships. They must be mainstream throughout education systems. Still, it's about 4.7 to be embedded in the curricula and all the process which will run in the coming months at national level, at global level as well. Finally, to reorient education systems around the culture of peace, students must be wired to defend the human rights, act for social justice, gender equality, and care, taking care for the environment. I think that taking care can really become something like, sounds like the claim of this new phase, of this new era. And UNESCO leads work worldwide on education for global citizenship, as you know, and sustainable development. These are the two sides of the same coin, and also for the prevention of violent extremism. We work with youth, teachers, governments, and it's about integrating these principles, practices into education systems, and it's about fostering a sense of shared responsibility for the future. These are really transformative principles, and peace today needs these transformative skills that education can transmit, and all education can transmit. For all these reasons, together with UNICEF, namely, and also the larger family of education partners, just coming from another important meeting today, the Global Education Forum, where we launched this sense of urgency we have. This big family we are honored to be member and part of is appealing to governments to prioritize education in the recovery funds, in the recovery process, as a solution, as a real solution, as a force of peace and the key driver of all the sustainable development goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefania. It's really, there's a lot there. I think as you begin to lay out some of the challenges, I think it occurs to me something that we've been talking about is that COVID-19 has proven to be a stress test for all kinds of systems and institutions throughout the world, and education is one of them, but also just simply governance in the state and how we provide for those most vulnerable. But I think it's nice that you mentioned also that it has produced certain spirits of solidarity. I mean, you see a lot of people coming together as well to try to help, but the problem is so large. It's difficult for that to fill the gap. But most important, I think, is this point that you make, that we're sort of entering into now this second phase. The risks that we've been focused on so much up to now is the risks of closure, that because of COVID-19, schools have closed. But now we're dealing with the challenges of safely reopening, and what specific challenges do those present. And something that comes to my mind is something that we've been discussing at IPI around COVID-19 is the extent at which, if at the beginning of this crisis, everyone was very focused on the medical issues, but that is a crisis. It's ballooning out into concentric circles to impact so many other different areas. And if we might say, as a vaccine is on the horizon, we're maybe near the end of the beginning of this crisis, we're nowhere near the beginning of the end. And in part, that's because it's having ripple effects. And so you mentioned, yes, we're now looking to reopen, but it's not just about reopening in a safe way. It's also about reopening in a sufficient way at a time when, because of the economic impacts, you have fiscal crises that have the risk of reducing education budgets. You have people that maybe it's safe for them to go back to school, but because of economic demands, they're going to drop out because they have to enter into the labor market and such. So there's all these other second order risks that we need to, in the international community, start paying more attention to. It really struck me, this point that you made, that education ideally should be a bulwark against inequality. But these economic demands suggest that the risk that our education systems will end up reinforcing inequalities, as opposed to be a bulwark against them, is increased in this context. So something that we all need. I'll turn the floor to you, Robert. Robert, please.
Thank you very much, Adam, and Your Excellency, and my dear friend Stefania. I really appreciate this opportunity. I just fully support what the distinguished panelists have mentioned already, and I think I'll just build on those comments, which I fully support, and do a little more deep diving into some of the issues that we see are taking place in various countries. But also, Adam, like you were just mentioning, I think I really appreciate that, and both the panelists have mentioned the urgency and the challenges and the urgency for action. And in a way, I think we could see this almost as a race that is currently undergoing, and that is a race between the challenges that children are facing and potential pitfalls, like not returning to school, which is in the tens of millions, potentially, if we don't all work together and collectively, proactively reach the most marginalized and bridge them back. These is one side of the race. The other is, can we indeed meet their needs before the implications are irreversible? Let me talk a little bit more about that. But I do think, while we recognize those very significant challenges, I think we do have an opportunity. I think we have potentially a once-in-a-generation opportunity now to reopen schools in a new way, to relook at schools and the critical role they play, and to support schools and education systems to maximize the potential to transform learning that we have now. It obviously is at the heart of the discussion around peace, and everyone is making the very clear and real linkage between education and the roles that schools can play in peace. So how can we maximize this reopening process so that it has the most positive impact on peace that it could potentially have. We are strongly advocating for schools to be prioritized in the reopening process, and all actions to be taken for and measures to be taken so that schools open safely. So while societies are open, we'd like schools to be amongst the first in the list and prioritized, and all actions to be taken for them to open. And that indeed is a race, because we have seen in previous school closures, including extended school closures as a result of Ebola, the longer schools are closed, the more vulnerable children become, and the more at risk of dropping out and never returning to their learning. So it is a race that schools must reopen, and actions need to be taken for them to be safe. Three main messages on when a country decides to reopen. We engage on three key issues around reopening. One, focus on reaching the most vulnerable. Number two, transform the way learning is provided, recognizing the world was experiencing a learning crisis before the pandemic and has been exacerbated. So we need to reopen the schools and teach in a different way and deliver the curriculum a different way. And third, meet the holistic needs of children. And I'm glad Her Excellency and Stefania have mentioned, and you, Adam, mentioned that social-emotional health, nutrition support, health support, protection are all critical support systems and services that are provided at schools that are going to become increasingly important. So three main messages. So a lot is happening at country level to realize interventions that meet those three areas. Let me just focus on a few on reaching the most vulnerable. In Brazil, we see there's very proactive work on an out-of-school search strategy, literally at community level, identifying at-risk children, working together to bridge them back into school. Burkina Faso, a very large-scale awareness campaign around the importance of girls' education, enabling girls to come back. And that's also recognizing adolescent girls are particularly disadvantaged and at risk of dropping out. In Burkina Faso, also more support was provided for meals in schools for the most vulnerable and leveraging the school system to meet the holistic needs of kids. In Tanzania, a lot of work between UNESCO, ourselves and UNICEF and UNHCR to work with children living in refugee camps in the country, and see how, again, schools can be leveraged to provide clean water and sanitation facilities, but also that there are enough learning spaces and expanding infrastructure so that the most vulnerable could bridge back into school. But so they enter, and there's let's say a wide open door in the school, and there's a welcome mat for all, that these type of interventions are helping. How can we maximize the impacts? Let me move to the second around learning and indeed promoting peace and understanding of diversity within schools. A lot of interventions are taking place, really exciting, in various countries. Like in Nicaragua, we're working closely with UNESCO and ourselves to provide recreation kits for students that focus specifically on their social emotional skills through play as they come back, recognizing that kids haven't played in many countries for months, including, Adam, you were mentioning your own child, my children too. Although I do try to step up and like substitute as a friend, I just do not seem to be as effective as their actual friends. So those type of interventions are taking place. I mentioned Nicaragua and other countries. In El Salvador, similar region, a lot of work around how do children, as they bridge back, have an opportunity to express themselves, and teachers are better skilled now at in recognizing the traumatic situation many children have faced with this disruption and enabling them to bridge back to school. There's been a lot of different interventions at country level around working with parents and providing parents the education sort of skills, if you'd like, or ways of coaching their children and supporting their children, both on learning, but also as they prepare and bridge back to school. In Myanmar, there was translation of materials for parents into 25 different ethnic languages to support children, to support parents, to support children as they come back to school, including with the all sort of pervasive now levels of stress that children are facing. And actually, I saw an interesting statistic this morning for the first time, based on a partner that we work with in the Middle East, that 80% of children in 4 countries in the Middle East that are in challenging situation. I served there just before this position. 80% of children rank the COVID-19 as their #1 concern at the moment. And these are children that are living often in very challenging circumstances. Refugees were a key part of that cohort that was interviewed. And it just goes to show that children are indeed facing very real stress, and schools need to be leveraged to deal with that. And again, interventions are taking place. Let me just wrap up by saying, I think, and Stefania, I know, speaks to this very frequently also, but the importance of reimagining education, and she's mentioned it now. And this disruption gives us an opportunity to indeed I do feel there's been an increased recognition of the importance of schools that play in communities by parents, by decision makers. I also think there's a recognition that as the schools were closed and now are reopening, we have an opportunity to reimagine how that front door is open in a school and what happens behind that door. And I fear that if we do not, and the challenges you've mentioned, Adam and Stefania mentioned also around financing, if we can't overcome issues like ensuring adequate resources for the reopening process, but also for the transformation over the short, medium, and long term that is now required due to, understandably, the contracted economies, the fiscal pressure that the governments are facing. But we are all, at least in the education sector, we are all kind of hands on deck, re-emphasizing the importance of that. I have an ill pet too, so that's what you're hearing in the background, but I'm just going to, I'll end there, and thank you very much for the opportunity. I look forward to the continued discussion.
Great, thank you, Robert. No, that's super, super helpful, and I think you provide some really concrete examples there, delivering on your 3 messages on need to focus on the most vulnerable, opportunities to transform learning, and the need to meet the holistic needs of students in this context. I think that's a really, really helpful way to frame it, and really concrete examples from Brazil, Burkina Faso, Tanzania, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Myanmar. The point in Myanmar, by the way, I think is really interesting in how you frame it, the need to support parents to support children. But I say it's a good segue because we've got a few questions in. One of them is from a mother from Brooklyn, Mima Spadola, Brooklyn, New York. And I say it's a segue to me because you know, at IPI we talk about international issues, and this is a global issue. But of course, you know, I've come to this conversation as a parent with a very local prism. And way too often, I think, in the developed world, we think of we're providing lessons for abroad. Ms. Spadola asks, kind of turns it around. She says, here in New York City, nearly 3/4 of our public school students live in poverty, with schools switching to remote learning last year, and now students are able to choose between partial in-school attendance or remote. What lessons does the work of UNICEF and UNESCO internationally provide to help us in New York understand how we can best attend to our most at-risk students? If I could just answer one question based upon what you said about Myanmar, as a parent, I would say, you know, parents could use a lot more help. But maybe to each of you, is there, in your experience in UNESCO and UNICEF, how do you see those lessons that you are learning in more fragile context applicable in the developing world? I mean, the developed world, or in the U.S., Europe, and elsewhere. Stefania, do you want to jump in there, or yeah?
Thank you. Just briefly, I mean, just reflecting a bit on the difference between these crises and this unprecedented pandemic or, big events which had already a strong impact on education. For instance, the Ebola crisis, which affected some countries in the sub-Saharan region, and dropout girls especially was one of the clear, already well quantified consequences. But now I think the real big difference of this crisis, it is the first time that globally, from the north to the south, every single citizen realized the importance of schools, the importance of, and the fragility of the system. I mean, because overnight, globally, school system had shut down. We started to monitor at the end of March, and in a few days, the peak reached 1.6 billion students. So the first lesson is that facing a real global challenge, there is a need of sharing practices to, build this. I mentioned solidarity. Solidarity means completely to build a platform where not only the international organizations as provider of and supporters of giving solutions to governments, but all ministers, the community of educators could find a new way of working together and facing the same challenge from this perspective. So I think these two lessons have been already learned, and I hope that, and this is very much about linked to the question of also the mission of the IPI. I mean, the question that through education, by education, is possible to build another kind of relationship between countries, also not to be simply between individuals. So I hope that this is a turning point that will not allow us to go back to the past. And the second and last lessons learned, Robert has already mentioned very well these 2 points, the role of community and families, which, usually we don't consider to be really within the constituency of education. No, there is a traditional boundary between the school community and what we find outside, including family and parents, that sometimes, especially in the north of the world, are a bit, the other side of the river. They are the counterpart and not the same part of the same mission. And we learned that parents, families, communities have a strong role in educational process. And I think that it's another very important legacy we don't have to lose. Over.
Adam, I'll just compliment what Stefania is saying. I think at school level, which is, I think the key is, first of all, set a goal, and the school has to be very open and with the parents and with teachers and with the principal and with the superintendents in the case of the next level up in many countries. The goal is for all children to be back in school, and even potentially with the reopening of school, find children that weren't in school before. Even can we take this opportunity to even access children that were never in school before? So first of all, very clear community level, all children back in school. Then secondly, which children are at risk, which children, understanding and measuring and proactively identifying those children that are struggling either with access to make it back or once they come back, their needs are not met. And that is very individualized, and that requires investment and tools to understand the context that each child is facing and enable those to be addressed. And we see countries doing very proactively doing that, but it requires local solutions. So that's second. And third, it's engagement. I think process, and Stefania has mentioned this with parent engagement. I think countries that have been most successful in reopening schools, success meaning to not have to then reclose, but also children were able to return, success, are those that had very significant engagement processes involving students themselves, teachers, parents, administrators, etc. So very heavily invest in communication and engagement opportunities now is critically important.
Great, thank you. I think those are obviously very transferable lessons. I mean, to make sure all children are in school, even those that maybe weren't in school before, identify the children most at risk, and the need to be proactive. I think, you know, it doesn't just happen. It really does. You need to be proactive and engagement. That's I'm gonna use that. That's really helpful. I have a couple more questions. One actually is right back to you, Robert, and this comes from Zimbabwe, from Wadizor Rakato, who is actually was the African Scholars Fellow. She asks, you mentioned personal emotional development of youth, and she asks, does UNICEF have evidence and data on the positive impacts of online experiential education that focuses on the personal and emotional development of youth during COVID? Is there data on that? Is that possible? She says especially in vulnerable contexts where education resources are already stretched. I guess it's a question of really what do we know about the impact of online education on this question of personal and emotional development of youth? Has there been studied? Do we know about that? Specific data?
I really appreciate the question. I think it's very, very important, because not only is it very important now during, as Stefania mentioned, we still have nearly 1 billion children not in school, but also, so can we meet their most social emotional needs through remote tools, but also as we plan reopening too, and looking at blended learning and increasingly the value of IT and the impact of IT enabled tools in classrooms, what indeed is the impact? My simple answer, but I'd be interested to hear Stefania's comments on this too, but and sadly it's going to be unsatisfactory. The evidence is mixed, and it's mixed because it depends on the tool, it depends on the context, and I think it's almost an unfair question to try and isolate the specific impact of an IT-enabled tool on the social-emotional needs and well-being of children, recognizing that that's a much broader, I mean, how children can be social-emotionally healthy is going to relate to many more things beyond just their IT-enabled tool. Now, having said that, there are some very exciting innovations that are IT-enabled that do indeed contribute and target social-emotional health, and successfully, there's some evidence that shows that they can successfully have a positive impact. It comes to attributes like the context specificity, how relevant the content is to each context, and being very sensitive to the content, to the context, and when I say context, doesn't necessarily mean a country. It can mean at subnational level. It can mean types of languages, the way issues are portrayed. It's also more tools that are more interactive than one way. And maybe that's stating the obvious, but still many IT-enabled tools are relatively top-down, relatively supply-oriented. So those that enable interaction, enable questioning, enable engagement are more effective. Those are what is my understanding of the evidence to date. I hope that's helpful.
No, that's helpful. Of course, then it raises the issue, as we talked earlier, that one of the solutions for the lack of access to online is, of course, to use radio and TV, which is not interactive. But it's you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't in some way.
I do just want to come back to the radio for 1 second. And Stefania, sure, you've heard this before, but we had some very interesting data from a country in West Africa that based on not a huge survey, but it's somewhat representative, that said children, younger children that were learning using the radio found it more personalized than the teaching they were receiving in their school. And the logic, I think, there being is a very high quality programming with teaching, and because it was from the radio and it seemed very personalized, if done very well, I think it can be felt like the teacher is speaking directly to you. But it's obviously not, it's maybe somewhat individual, or you feel it is, but it's obviously not interactive. But it was a fascinating sort of indication of what's possible even through the radio.
Great. Tijani, I want to get you in here and you can respond to some of this, but also we've got one, Ms. Rukato of Zimbabwe also has a specific question for you as well on peace education. You mentioned the principle of solidarity and also the education as a tool to bridge divisions. She asked, what specific strategies can be applied for better embedding this kind of approach as we rethink education, as we reopen schools and such? What sort of specific strategies does UNESCO apply to that?
I think that the point I summarize a bit to touch upon in my presentation, the two sides of 4.7, just to go back to the target of one of the target of SDG 4, is really very much about developing more and better than in the past these two dimensions: global citizenship and education for sustainable development. And this is about curriculum developing. It's about prioritizing these topics in terms of content, I mean, at curriculum level, but it's also about, let me say, just looking at the lessons already learned in this crisis, taking the opportunity of, valorizing, optimizing some kind of new social networks and valorizing these solutions that beyond technologies students and teachers had discovered as their own tools in order to face the challenge of not being able to see each other, to live in a physical classroom. So it's not only about content and curriculum development, which is a very important strategy that UNESCO is running since the launching of the 2030 agenda, but it's part, as I said, of the core mandate of UNESCO since the establishment of the organization. But now it's really very much about the how. It's very much about methodologies and compensating a bit these social physical distancing with not social distances, but a new kind of a social networking. And I think that, for instance, the way some teachers organize the virtual classroom is a very interesting one. It's about, for instance, personalizing special educational processes for children with disabilities. This is something that sometimes technology can allow you to do better than in the physical classroom and the physical space of learning. And it's about valorizing innovation that maybe is one of the positive side of this disruption of education that we are living within. And I think that on this basis, still, if we can convince in the near future, in the coming weeks, political leaders to prioritize education as a public sector and then invest in funds on that or on innovation, not only reopening in terms of giving resources to open doors of schools, but to see what behind the doors will be rethought, reimagined, and developed differently. I think that it's a part of the process that we can really start in a different way.
Yeah. We only have a few more minutes. I mean, I feel like we could talk a lot about so much of this, but I've got sort of two questions here that if I'll just sort of paraphrase them into a question, because they're sort of comments, but they're similarly related. One is from Tunisia, from Raouf Riahi, and one is from Jude Nibu, but I don't think he says where he's from. But they both have similar questions about what I would call the urban-rural divide. That part of the problem is that many governments' education systems are centralized, and the needs of urban students and rural students are so different. And a lot of these issues that we talk connectivity and all this is very different in the urban space and the rural space. So I would just pose it as a question: what strategies? How can we incorporate that into the reopening plans? I mean, there's a tendency, as you say, governments have to commit, we have to reinvest, but it's a real challenge because as Tijani, you mentioned, budgets are being cut. What is UNESCO, what is UNICEF doing about these divisions within not just individuals, the most vulnerable, but also at the national level, urban rural question, how we can cater education policies to that effect. So why don't we go in reverse order? Robert, why don't you give us your final thoughts, and then we'll go to Stefania.
Well, thanks. I'll be very brief. And Stefania mentioned that percentage of countries that, or the percentage of children that have not been reached during this period, and a rural-urban divide is one piece of that indeed. And we're finding children in remote locations are more disadvantaged during this period because of lack of access, because of often living in vulnerable and disadvantaged areas. So it requires concerted effort. It requires increasing resources to target vulnerable areas. And it also requires basically looking at the individual needs of each area, including in rural versus or compared to urban, and overcoming those at local level with the goal of enabling all children to return. So really, I come back to the earlier point, which is context-specific solutions with a goal overall of all children coming back and having their needs met in schools. Let me just sum up by thanking you, Adam, thanking IPI. Great working with you again, Stefania, as a fellow panelist, and Her Excellency, and really appreciate this opportunity. And again, we work so closely, UNESCO, UNICEF, together, and other agencies. The challenge is enormous. I do think the opportunity is equally once in a generation, and it's really an appeal for engagement and support with all your listeners and supporters of IPI in this journey as we move forward. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Stefania, please, final words.
Just briefly from my side, I would like to refer to the framework that we published together with Rob and the World Bank, our colleague Andy Saveda, recently. It's about reopening schools. And one of the principles you can find there is that I summarize like this: one size for all doesn't work in this context. And the more you can adopt solutions which are context-oriented, the better it is for, reaching the goal of addressing the specific challenges. So this is the model we suggest to be adopted by governments and ministries, and that's the job we are doing together in order to support them. And to summarize, looking for some keywords: engagement, you mentioned; solidarity, you mentioned; partnership, the last one. I think what we need now is really to strongly work together. We are doing a big effort from the international organization side, I think unprecedented in my opinion, in terms of integrating all our competency, expertise in a one common mission, which is about continuity learning, but it's also about assuring education as a basic human right. What we are doing, what we are discussing, what we are working together is about that. So thank you very much for this opportunity. At the end for me of a long day, Rob, you are still something to do, but it's a great pleasure. It's been a great pleasure as usual.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really been a really fascinating conversation that I feel we could continue on. And I think the takeaway that I grab from this conversation is that the challenges are tremendous. I had said in my opening 1 billion students. You said 1.6 billion. It just grows, and there really is this real risk of this becoming a generational issue problem. But Robert kept mentioning the once in a generation opportunity that this presents. And in some sense, it provides me with hope, not because you need this disaster in order to provide an opportunity, but because what this disaster highlights is issues that existed before COVID. It sheds light on so many issues that needed to be addressed before. And one can hope that this can mobilize people to take action to address these long-standing issues that many people in the education field have been ringing the alarm bells on for quite a long time. And also that what it does in some way, it seems to me as a New York parent and look at the experiences in Brazil and Zimbabwe and Tunisia and such, have a lot in common with the challenges. And so if shared experiences can build solidarity, that can also mobilize action to make change. And so that really fills me with some form of optimism if you can at such a time. Thank you again so much for everyone who participated. Thank you, Tijani. Thank you, Robert, and Ambassador Fatima.